Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm here with Edward Dodge, author of A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. Right there. Doesn't that look nice? Yep, brilliant. All right, and let's see. From our interview with Ralph Ellis, I have to remind everybody climate change is real, and carbon dioxide does affect global temperature. I'm just messing with you in case Ralph is watching.
I mean, I could do a whole thing. I work in energy and environment stuff. I could give you a whole shtick on climate change myself, but we're not going to do that today. That's a different, that's a different deep dive. I'm here to talk about the mother goddess, which is actually related to climate change. Actually, it does circle around because we're talking about Mother Earth here and Mother Earth traditions, and there is actually a connection between our sensibilities of Mother Earth today and indigenous teachings on Mother Earth and these old traditions. I actually totally believe that the Native Americans, they crossed the land bridge from Eurasia, and I believe that these traditions go back to the Paleolithic, go back to the Ice Age, to the Venus figurines of the Ice Age, and there's some commonalities in what was taken across to the Native Americans. The Asherah pole, I'm getting sidetracked here, but just for one moment here, the Asherah pole, which is a carved wooden pole that, is the object of the mother goddess of Asherah, the mother goddess in the Old Testament, that the Hebrew prophets continually chop down. I believe that that's akin to a Native American totem pole. I believe that they're drawn from the same Ice Age traditions, that this stuff goes way, way, way back. People have making these carved wooden poles since forever. They find them all over Siberia. So I think there's a common tradition there. I mean, it's a different discussion. We'll leave that aside for now, but I do think there is a connection between our sensibilities on Mother Earth today, Native Americans, and the ancient mother goddess stuff that I like to talk about.
Yeah. I was reading about, the earliest deities that we have. And it would seem that Inanna is the oldest, the Sumerian goddess.
Well, in terms of that's the oldest writing that we have, right? So she's there at the invention of writing. We don't know the names of any gods prior to writing, but there's not a lot of imagery either. Like if you go back to I agree with what you're saying. Inanna is there at the dawn of writing, and she is Venus, and she is the oldest named version of the Venus goddesses, the goddess of love and war, which is Astarte in the Old Testament, and Ishtar in Babylon, and Inanna before that, Aphrodite. The Romans called her Venus. But these other traditions, with the carved figurines, the Venus figurines, they go back 30, 40,000 years. They're to the dawn of culture, really, when we had the first cave paintings, the first Venus figurines, and the first ritual burials all start to show up around the same rough time period, around 40,000 years ago. And this would appear to be the beginnings of of culture, really, of where we stop being, the stereotypical cavemen. And perhaps that's the moment where we start speaking and start telling stories and start developing a real, where the raised intellect, we have the cognitive leap, if you will, that starts to separate us more permanently from the rest of the animal kingdom. That's all pretty speculative, but you do see the cave paintings, the Venus figurines, and the ritual burials all show up in the same time period.
Yeah. So would you kind of be of the opinion that the earliest conceptions of deity that we have were female?
I would think that mother came first before father. When you talk about Mother Earth and the Heavenly Father and the traditions that we do have, the mother is always close at hand. She is, the Virgin Mary. You pray to her to intercede on your behalf to God, because God, the creator of the universe, is distant. He's out in space wrestling with the cosmos. Even to this day in religious discussions, we struggle with it. Is God paying attention to us? Does God love us as individuals? Or are we just spinning out in the blackness on our own? It's a real question, because sometimes you can feel, in a mystical sense, you can feel the presence of God in your life. The kingdom of heaven is within. You can feel it right inside you. If you're of that sort. But other times, God is very far away, and it's hard to imagine the creator of the universe paying much attention to us as us little insects that we are crawling across the earth. I mean, wouldn't the creator of the universe have much bigger things to worry about, don't you think? And I think that's the depiction of El in the ancient world, that that he was seen as being far away, and that part of what makes the Israelites special among the Canaanites, because the Israelites are Canaanites. They come out of the broader Canaanite world, but at the same time, they have their own unique identity. They're not just like everybody else. So they are worshiping. They're coming out of the same worship. They have the same gods. They have the same pantheon of gods with El at the top, but they call themselves Israelites. They're the guys who are focused directly on the worship of El. And, so what is that? What does that say about them? I mean, I think it says a couple of things. I think it says they're patriarchal, first of all. They're paying attention to the father, not to the mother. And that, that's their tribal identity. How much theology is behind it, I don't know. But, in the early days, but they call themselves the followers of El. That has to mean something. And at a minimum, it means something patriarchal, because that's what we're going to get into today, is the matriarchal and patriarchal. So I've to get to what I wanted to talk about today, which is that, so I wrote this book, but I've continued to do research since then, and I came across some new material that really helps bring some things together that had been sort of questions for me, because I've been talking about, what does Asherah represent? So my whole book is rooted in the question of Asherah in the Old Testament. Who is this? Scholars call her the wife of God. So who is she? What does she represent? What does it mean that God had a wife and then God no longer had a wife at a certain point? What did that represent culturally on the ground? That's what I wanted to know. And so I learned that she represents the women's traditions. These are women's religions. They represent the women, that there's this motif of the triple goddess, the mother, maiden, and death, with three goddesses that come together. So in the Old Testament, it's Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, with Astarte as the Venus character, the goddess of love and war. Asherah is the mother goddess, or at least the mother of the gods. And Anat is the death goddess. So she brings death and destruction and the termination of all things. And she's like Kali of the Hindus. And so these three goddesses are worshipped together, and they represent the women's traditions. They represent fertility, the cycle of life. They're rooted in nature, Mother Earth, what we call Mother Earth today, but that was not a term they used, but we call her Mother Earth. These are representing fertility. They're representing childbirth and death and the whole cycle of life. And this is what the women were in charge of. They gave birth, and they were the midwives, and they were the nurses. They were the potion makers dealing with the plant drugs. Sex was women's business, the ritual prostitution. We'll get into this because I've been trying to understand how the ritual prostitution really worked. But they had ritual prostitution, and they were doing a lot of it. These are very promiscuous cultures. So how does that work? Because we don't have, on one hand, we do have a promiscuous culture, but officially we don't. Officially, we tell people not to be promiscuous, even if people break the rules. But we are constrain our sex lives for a reason, because we have paternal cultures, and we have to control who the baby daddies are. If the women are running around having sex with everybody, then you don't know who the baby daddy is. And it's very important in Western civilization that we do know who the baby daddy is. And so we constrain women's sex lives in order to confirm, that we know, at least at a pretty good, we have a pretty good judgment of who the father is. But if you're going to have a very promiscuous culture, that gets lost. So how does that work? Well, what I've come to understand now, and what I'd been suspecting all along, is that they really did have maternal bloodlines. They were passing the bloodlines, mother-daughter, including in the royalty, so that royal lines were passing through the daughter of the queen, not through the king naming his son. It's coming down to the daughter, and I'll show you where this is. But secondly, that, and this is the important piece, is in marriages, and this is the other piece that you can see, that in these matriarchal cultures, is that when they had the marriages, the husband went to go live with the wife's family, not the other way around. So if the husband goes and lives with the wife family, that means the women are all staying together. The mothers, daughters, sisters, and all the children are all staying together in their own clan. They're maintaining their family wealth. They're maintaining the inheritances, the possessions. And in the case of a divorce, they can send the man packing. And the women, there's no loss to the women, no materially, because they are staying with their clan, with their family. So this is obviously hugely advantageous to women, over men. And so the research I've come across, both an older paper from 1910 and a modern paper from the last couple of years that's sort of confirming the same thing, is talking about how these what we call matriarchal cultures, and it did not mean women dominating the men. It just meant that the women had these matriarchal bloodlines and these marital customs I'm talking about, that these were actually really common, and that these were the default of the ancient Semitic tribes in early Mesopotamia, all over the Arabian world. And so the roots of the Hebrews, the Assyrians, all these different people groups were these matriarchal tribes. And they existed all the way up until Muhammad came along, forming Islam, that the world he was born into, the pagan Arabian world that he was born into in the 6th century CE, so the 600s, this was still going on. And that this is something that he's fighting with, and that the Arab conquest finally puts the final blow onto it. But my argument is that these matriarchal and patriarchal traditions the matriarchal are older, but that over the course of the Bronze Age, the patriarchal traditions rise up, and that they are coexisting for a very long period of time. Like, they could be in the same town, in the same community, people can know each other, they can be intermarrying, but that they are coexisting for a very, very long time. And that this is at the heart of the conflict between the Israelites and the Canaanites. The whole reason why the Israelites treat the Canaanites as such foreigners and say so explicitly, we don't want you marrying them, is because of these matriarchal bloodlines. If you're an Israelite man and go marry a Canaanite woman, you're going to be marrying into these matriarchal bloodlines. And the Hebrew prophets, they don't like it. The biblical writers, they want to get rid of these customs. Mm-hmm. And so this is why they're banning it. But at the time of the first temple period, this is a hot argument. This is like the heat of the battle is going on, immediately after the Bronze Age collapse and into the first temple period. And then by the time you get to the end of the 500 BC, around during the Babylonian exile, these traditions they've been put down for all intents and purposes. And you're seeing the same thing in the Greek mythology.
Now, do we have any surviving texts from the Canaanite tradition? Or
we can show you in the Bible. I'll show you where it is in the Bible.
Okay.
So let me show you where it is. So as far as like Canaanite texts, we don't have that much. We see some, and the stuff we do have is all quite new in terms of like our knowledge. So the Ugaritic text is the main treasure trove that shows, the Canaanite gods in action. All the gods of the Old Testament, El and Baal and Asherah and Astar and Nanat, they're all in action in the Ugaritic text. And Yahweh is not there because Yahweh hadn't entered the scene yet. These are really, really valuable. If you haven't read them yet, I highly recommend reading the Baal cycle, because this shows how Baal comes to power, because Baal was the king of the gods. So for the Canaanites, El is the sky father. Let's take a step back. There's two background pieces. Let's talk about the Canaanite gods, and then let's talk about the timeline for a moment. So the Canaanite gods, just real briefly, the pantheon that they were worshiping, and this is the same gods that the Phoenicians were worshiping. So they were all over the Mediterranean, and they're pretty well understood, even if we don't have too much of their mythology. But El, so Elohim of the Bible, El, he's the heavenly father. He's this ancient sky father who's been worshipped for a very, very long time. They called him An and Anu in Mesopotamia. So he's there in the old story. Just the same way Inanna becomes Ishtar, becomes Astarte. El had been An before that. So it's the same God for all intents and purposes. He's very, very ancient. He's been around forever. Mm-hmm. He's the sky father, but he's distant and out in space, and he's not actively a part of like people's lives. So his son is the king of the gods. And in this case, it's Baal. He's the king of the gods for the Canaanites. He's the warrior storm god, thunder and lightning, just like Zeus, just like Marduk, just like Enlil, because these Indo-European gods have a common pattern. So you can see this pattern all the way through. So the son is the king of the gods. He's the one who's actively being worshipped, and he's the one who's actively bringing the rain, so to speak. And then the other male gods that are important are, for the Canaanites, are Baal and Yam. Or Yam and Mot, I mean. So Baal, Yam, and Mot are like three brothers. They're just like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Baal is like Zeus, the king of the gods. Yam is like Poseidon. He's the god of the seas, god of the oceans, and he's the biggest rival to Baal. He is the other like potential king of the gods. And then Mot is the god of death, and he is just like Hades. And we know that these are the Hebrew gods because those are the Hebrew words for Yam is the Hebrew word for sea. So it gives us a pretty good indication this was their old god. And Mot likewise is a Hebrew word for death. So this does give us a pretty good idea that the Israelites were Canaanites and that these were their gods. And then for the goddesses, the triple goddess is Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, who I've mentioned. Asherah, the lady of the sea, they call her, because the sea was like the womb of Mother Earth, that they believed all life came out of the sea, so they call her Lady of the Sea. Astarte is the goddess of love and war. She's Venus. She's the queen of heaven. She's really the most popular one. She's a prostitute, which is really, really important. We really need to, the modern day scholars tend to downplay all the sex, and I think they're getting it wrong. I think these are very sexual cultures, and are really putting women's sexuality on display, because if you've got maternal bloodlines, you can do that. So Astarte is the goddess of love and war. Again, these matriarchal cultures, they're organized around the women, around the clans, and around their queens. And so the women they call the men to battle. And you'll see this with Deborah. We'll talk about her. You see this in the text. And then the third goddess is Anat, as I mentioned. She's like the Canaanite Kali. She's dripping in blood. She's Baal's consort. She brings Baal back to life in the Baal cycle. She wears a skull necklace and a belt of human hands. She loves killing and chopping off men's heads, just like fills her with joy. She bathes in their blood. She's just utterly terrifying. And I call her She Who Must Not Be Named because they don't actually mention her in the Old Testament. They mention Asherah, and they're always like, want to cut down the Asherah poles. So they mention Asherah and they insult her. They mention Astarte and they insult her. They call her Ashtoreth, which means shameful Astarte. And so they mention her many times, but always in these very condescending, divisive ways. But they never mention Anat, because to mention her would be to give her identity, and to give her, like, naming something is very powerful in mythology. To give something a name is to make it real. So to not name something is to have it not be real. And to name Anat is to acknowledge her existence. But if you read in the Baal cycle, you see Anat's character. Anat goes up to, everybody's terrified of Anat. Every single other god quakes in fear of Anat, including, well, he doesn't necessarily quake in fear, but she can go right up to her father, El, the creator of the universe, God of the Bible. She walks right up to him when she wants something. You know how she behaves? Does she ask him nicely? Does she come on bended knee? No. She comes up and immediately threatens him. She says, I'm going to throw you down like a lamb. I'm going to smash your skull in and make your gray beard run red with gore. And he says, what do you want? I'll give it to you. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't get insulted. He doesn't say, how dare you speak to me like this? And this is in repeated stories, not just one story. Lots of stories have her approaching El and demanding things of him, threatening to tear down his house with her mighty arms. And then he promptly gives her what she wants. So she really is quite terrifyingly powerful.
Yeah. So it is a bit of, what's the term for it? She's portrayed as just doing whatever she wants with the main deity. That's what's the term for, like, a religious?
She defeats Yam in battle. She destroys Mot. So the way she brings Baal back to life, so Baal dies at one point in the story. The way he gets brought back to life is that Anat goes up to Mot, the god of death, like Hades, and kills him. She cuts him, and she grabs him by the collar and says, give me back my brother, screams in his face, and then cuts him in half with a sword, burns him with fire, grinds him up in a sieve, and feeds him to the birds. There's no character like this in Greek mythology that would destroy Hades like that. So she is really just beyond power. So, Kali gets the same kind of treatment in Hindu mythology. And then, so there's other examples of this triple goddess. This is a motif that repeats. So for the Hindus, modern day Hindus, you see it in the wives of Shiva. So Parvati is the mother goddess. She transforms into Durga, who's the warrior maiden. And she also transforms into Kali, who I'm just talking about. And then, but it's all the same goddess, just taking these different forms. And that's modern day Hinduism. But you can go back to the most ancient of Egyptian texts, and it's the eyes of Ra. The daughters of Ra is the creator god, the sun god who creates everything. Some of the first things he creates is his daughters, who he calls the eyes of Ra. So that's Sekhmet, who is the death goddess. She's the most powerful one. Bastet is the beautiful maiden, and Hathor is the mother goddess. So that's in Egypt. In Greece, you've got, or in the Romans, it's Hecate, Selene, and Diana. You've got, I'm missing one. Anyway, there's a bunch of them. They're all over the place. The triple goddess repeats. It's a repeating motif. And it's Asherah, Astarte, and Anat in the Old Testament.
So the goddess is always underneath the man god. Yeah.
No, not these Bronze Age goddesses. They are not subservient to any men.
But there's a higher god, yeah? That's a man.
He's got a contour. His wife is the mother goddess, and she is treated with complete respect. And El and Asherah are not like, El doesn't boss Asherah around. If you read the text, El asks Asherah her opinions on things, and Asherah, she makes the choice of who's going to be king of the gods. El stamps it with his authority, but Asherah makes the choice. Asherah is the one who says it's going to be Baal, and El says, okay, all right, it'll be Baal. Asherah is given the utmost of respect. They are not subservient. Anat is not subservient. She raises Baal back to life. And Ishtar, Astarte, she's not subservient. Her husband is Tammuz or Dumuzi. She's not subservient to him either. She kills him and sends him to hell and then raises him back to life. So these goddesses are not, these are matriarchal goddesses. They are not subservient to any patriarchal gods. And this is a distinction with the Greeks. So let's get to the timeline here for a second, because it'll make a little more sense. The whole Old Testament, in my argument, tracks quite clearly in the second and first millenniums, the local political context of both the Egyptian Empire and of the Bronze Age collapse. And so what you get in the Abraham, by tradition, is said to be around 2000 BC, which is the middle of the Bronze Age. Most scholarship would, and what I agree with, is that push it all 200 years later from the traditional scholarship, and then it tracks quite closely with history. So you get Abraham around 1800 BC, and then his descendants are Isaac and Jacob, right? Then they go into Egypt. They're treated friendly at first, and then not so friendly. 400 years of subjugation. Well, this tracks well with the Hyksos, who are Semitic peoples and somehow related to the Israelites, whether they're directly the same people or not, or just a kinship group. They ruled Egypt for a century and then get kicked out. And then Egypt rules Canaan for the next 400 years, from 1550 to 1150. They rule Canaan with an iron fist. And so we know that the Israelites did not enter Canaan until after the Egyptians pull out. And the Egyptians start to pull out with the Bronze Age collapse, which is around 1200 BC, and for the next couple hundred years. And this is where the Mycenaean Greeks break up, and then the Hittites, and there's all this destruction across the Near East, across the Mediterranean. All the empires break up. You get a 200 or 300 year period that's completely lawless. This is the backdrop of both the Trojan War for the Greeks and the Exodus for the Hebrews. And this is where the Israelites now enter Canaan at the same time as the Philistines, at the same time as all the other characters from the Old Testament, the Moabites and the Edomites, all the other groups that the Israelites are dealing with once they come into Canaan. All these people, they show up in Canaan at the same time. After 1175, after this big old war, Egypt fights this big old war with the Sea Peoples in 1175. The Sea Peoples settle in Gaza and become the Philistines. And the kingdom of Moab, the kingdom of Edom, all show up at the same time. The Israelite hilltop settlements start to be built here and have now been discovered by the archaeologists. So we know that it's like after 1175 is when everybody comes into Canaan and all these events start happening. And then everything really starts tracking in the Bible, tracks real history. King David takes Jerusalem around 1000 BC. That seems to have been a historical event. We don't have evidence for United Kingdom, but we do have evidence that all the kings that are being named, both in Israel and in Judah, and all the events after that going forward are all documented in the neighboring cultures. So we have the Assyrians talking about invading Egypt are invading Israel. We have the Assyrians talking about attacking Jerusalem. We have records from Moab and Edom and Egypt that talk about the events of the Old Testament. So we know that from like 1000 or at least 850 BC going forward, everything is tracking history very closely. But you can also see that the Bible is also it's history, but it's a propaganda version of history. It's like totally propagandistic, which all the writings of the Bronze Age in that time, in the Iron Age, after the Bronze Age collapsed, we're into the Iron Age. All the writings of those days are all propaganda. Everybody that's like any official writing is like, my side is great, the other side is horrible. We defeated them, we wiped them out, and they are no more. Like that's how everybody writes, and that's how the Israelites are writing too.
So you would say that the Canaanites were pre-existing to the area, and that the Israelites came and conquered them, kind of in line with the Old Testament?
I mean, I think the Israelites are a nomadic shepherding tribe out of the broader Canaanite world. I mean, I'll leave it to other people to like go into the nuances of the deeper history, but I do think they are real people. I think they're a nomadic shepherding tribe. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who knows when they're originally written, but they are accurately representing the second millennium BC. Like they are accurately representing the cultures and time periods of what was going on, in 1600 BC. I mean, these stories do, they could have been written 1,000 years later, but they are rooted in that time period. And I think that they are based on legends and then get updated over time.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Hyksos, that you would say that's the origin of the Hebrews?
Well, I mean, even in ancient times, they thought that the Israelites were at least related to the Hyksos. Whether some people, I mean, I'll leave it to other people to argue whether they are like those are the very. I mean, Ralph Ellis would say the Israelites are the Hyksos, like that's them explicitly. I'm not saying that, but they are Semitic people from Canaan. And the Israelites are Semitic people from Canaan. The Hyksos call themselves the shepherd kings. The Israelites are shepherding peoples. I mean, they're at least related. They would have at least been friendly enough, or at least out of the same cultural backdrop. Maybe they didn't like each other on a personal level, but they're from the same culture for sure.
Sure. So there we go. So we started by giving Ralph Ellis a little bit of guff, and now we're kind of being in a little bit of agreement here. So
Ralph has got some entertaining stories, entertaining theories to think about. I don't really buy his timeline, but that's not what we're talking about.
You'd push it later, you said?
I would push the whole timeline 200 years after what tradition says. So tradition says the Exodus is around 1400 or 1450. I would say it's more like 1200 or 1250. The first mention of Israel in archaeology is the Merneptah stele from 1210 BC, and it's a victory stele by the pharaoh Merneptah. And this is actually the beginning of the wars of the Bronze Age collapse. So there's a big attack by the Libyans, and then they also march into Canaan. And at one point, they say that they identify Israel and say, we wiped them out. Their seed is no more. And it's a victory by the pharaoh. I think this has got to be around the Exodus. And I'm sort of curious, it's just a spitballing idea, if maybe this isn't the flip side of the Exodus story. The Israelites talk about how they escaped Egypt by the skin of their teeth, being pursued by the Egyptian army, and only by crossing the Reed Sea were they saved by the grace of God. Well, maybe this is the Pharaoh's version of the same event, saying we chased them out and we wiped them out, and we killed them all, except maybe there's a couple stragglers who survived.
Interesting.
I'm just making that. That's just a theory, but the timing would work, because then you've got 40 years of wandering. If that's 1210, and then Egypt is still strong in 1210, they're still ruling Canaan with an iron fist. Their armies are still in Canaan, but it's 1175. So that's what, 35 years later, that they have the big war that Egypt really starts to break up. Well, there's your 40 years of wandering right there. So I think the timing works out, and then after 1175 is when the Israelites are actually able to enter Canaan along with the Philistines and everybody else. And that we can say for sure. Like, if you think that the Israelites, the Exodus is 1450, then you got to explain for 200 years what they were doing when there was no Philistines, no Edomites, no Moabites, just the Israelites were just on their own And in Egypt, we know for certain was ruling Canaan. We know for a fact, like there's lots and lots of like scholarship that there's no dispute about the political rules and the broad strokes of, who is in charge of, what territories in this time period. Like it's pretty thorough at this point. Now, to be fair to the traditionalists, it's new information. This is all new information from the last century that's been dug up by archaeologists and modern scholarship. And if you're not paying attention to the modern archaeology and only information you've got is, the traditional stuff, then I can understand why you wouldn't agree. But if judging by the archaeology, there's no question that the entry into Canaan is 12th century. It's in the 1100s for sure.
For sure. And, with the violent goddess, I need to shut off my phone here. It keeps beeping. Let's see. All right, there we are. So is there something of a female demiurge with this, violent goddess chopping the heads off of people and, being rude to the other gods?
Well, I think that, she represents a cycle of life. And at the end of all things, the universe will be, imploded or exploded, whatever, and, reborn again at these, these endless, these long cosmological cycles. And I think that's what she represents. And I think she just represents death. I think that death is part of life, and there is no life without death. It's this paradoxical aspect. So you've got the mother goddess who's bringing forth life and representing maternity, but they're also going to hold your hand as the hospice nurses on your way out the door. And when you ash to ashes and dust to dust, and you're going to return to your mother when you're buried in the earth. And that's what I think she represents. And the fact that there is no defeat of death. Like there's nothing that conquers death that we know of. And so it makes sense that she is, peerless, that no one can really, El may create the universe, but she can destroy it. So, and he never disputes that. He never disputes it. Ra says that Sekhmet is the most powerful deity of all. He says that she doesn't even know her power. So yeah, I think that's what she represents, in Kali. She is really popular in India nowadays. Like Kali is like super, super popular. So, and it's just seen as this flip side of the mother goddess. Kali is not considered a terrifying goddess. She's considered a loving mother goddess, but it's this terrifying form of her because so much is embodied in the mother. And, we've been robbed of these traditions in the West. We don't really know. Our cultural imagination hasn't really given us the toolkit to really think about these things in depth. I think about them and I'm trying to put it together. But there's a lot that as a society that's we don't really understand. Like the whole idea of these maternal bloodlines. It's the ramifications of a mother-daughter bloodlines versus father-son bloodlines would be completely transformational of all of society. Western civilization is completely built on a backbone of paternity. And this is the way we organize our families around the father being in charge of his wife and children and the nuclear family. This is the bedrock of the Christian Western culture. And this is why cultural conservatives are so concerned with maintaining the order of the traditional marriage and traditional family. It really touches a nerve, gay marriage or divorce. All this stuff really touches a nerve for cultural conservatives because, they have a point. The traditional marriage, the traditional male patriarchal marriage is in fact the bedrock foundation of how we structure Western civilization. And if we had maternal bloodlines, you wouldn't call it Western civilization. It would be something else. And this is what they're fighting about. And this is exactly what they're fighting about. So let me go into, all right, you can go more questions, but I want to get into some of these stories here because it's really fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. Where do you think it comes from? Why did we successfully smash the matriarchy and end up with the patriarchal.
My take on it is that it arrives with the beginning of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age gives us weapons, and this is when men and we start to get permanent warfare. The Neolithic settlements had become prosperous enough that now there was stuff worth stealing, and you have people start inventing weapons that gives you the ability to kill people. It's not to say people are perfectly peaceful or never fought before, but when all you're armed with is spears and, clubs or, the bone of some animal, like people are pretty evenly matched in a fight. And it's hard for like one group to just come on and wholesale slaughter another group if everybody's got the same weapons, But if one group's got swords and the other group doesn't have swords, then, watch out. One group of 10 men can slaughter hundreds of people.
Why not 10 women?
What's that?
Why not 10 women? Why are the men fighting?
No, the women are fighting. There were definitely women warriors, don't get me wrong. But there were loads of women warriors. In fact, the farther back in time you go, the more women warriors we've got. So it's not that women didn't fight or the women can't kill. Women most certainly can. But as we know, like stereotypically, men are typically the fighters. Men are the ones who sent out to hunt. And the men are
why, though?
Physically stronger.
Because the men are stronger?
Yeah. The men are stronger. The women are, the women are stuck with the babies to a certain extent. And so the men, even in traditional, way back when in matriarchal cultures, the women were still holding down the homes and they were sending the men off to war. Some women would join them, but by and large, the men go off on trade missions. The men go off on, the hunt, and the men leave and the women stay behind and maintain the homes. But the women would have money. They would have wealth. They would be running businesses. They'd be, doing all this weaving, which is like industry. They're selling product. The women could own slavery. But slavery and warfare and kingship, all this stuff shows up around in the 4th millennium BC. So 3500 BC or so. This is when the beginning of slavery. This is when we start to see the warlords start to assert themselves as kings. Because there's no evidence of kings in the Neolithic. There's no evidence of like some, great man leading the tribe. In the Neolithic cultures, what we see are men and women being treated equally, and we don't see kings. The kings and slavery all show up at the same time with the bronze weapons.
Yeah. So, maybe it's kind of outside of our scope, though. Why is it women with the kids? And why not men stay home with the kids?
Do you nurse babies? We're not nursing,
Yeah, I guess that would make sense. And
it's biology. I don't think it's any grand theory. I think it's just, I think biology drives a lot of this stuff. Like, I don't think biology is quite as immutable as some people would have us believe nowadays.
And so men are stronger. So they're like, when it comes to brass tacks, we have to fight the other tribe. We send the men.
Yeah, right? But the women would be calling the men up. In these matriarchal cultures, the women would be calling now's the time to fight and sending the men off. And the women that were capable would join them, but for the most part, it's the men doing the fighting.
Yeah. Is there any real substantive difference to matriarchal versus patriarchal?
Well, I'll show you.
There we go. Good lead in, right?
Yeah. So where we can see, these papers I've come across recently show me that where we can see, just as we can see vestiges of polytheism in the Old Testament, we can see vestiges of these matriarchal marriages in the Old Testament, especially on the older characters. So we'll start with the very first one. We'll start with Abraham. Abraham, the father of it all, the father of the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, he is said to be the first patriarch, right? If he's the first patriarch, that implies pretty strongly that it was not a patriarchal world that he was born into. And in fact, that's exactly what we see with his relationship with Sarah, with his wife and his children. So if you know the story, you know that he's married to Sarah. Now, the name Sarah, let's talk about this for a second. The root Sar is the Semitic word for chief. And so Sarah just means, or chief or chieftain. So Sarah is just the feminized version of chieftain. She's the chieftainess. She's the matriarchal chieftainess of her tribe. And so the women were in charge of, the baby making, basically. And so as you know the story, they don't have children until a very, very ripe old age. And initially, Sarah doesn't have any children at all. And so she offers up her slave woman Hagar to go be a concubine for Abraham and have a child, which they do. She impregnates Hagar, and she has a child with him. Now check this out. I want to get the quote here properly. This is it's in Genesis. Oh, I got it in my notes here. Sorry. Skip past it. All right, so Genesis 16. Genesis 16:5. So he has a woman, he has a child with Hagar, whose name is Ishmael. Now, if this was a patriarchal world, that firstborn child, it would have been Abraham's prerogative to make that his heir and to make Hagar his wife. And which it would appear that he starts to do. He raises Hagar up, and this offends Sarah. So in Genesis 16:5, Sarah said to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. She despises me." Abraham responds in 16:6. The next line says, "You're right. Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think is best." So Sarah and Hagar are not getting along. Sarah ends up sending Hagar out, and she leaves, and she's kicked out because it was Sarah's prerogative to do this. Meanwhile, Sarah eventually has a child who is Isaac, and the Jews and Christians trace their heritage through Isaac, the second born child, the matriarchal child. And to this day, Jewish identity is traced through the Jewish mothers, which is a vestige of these old matrilineal traditions. Now, the Muslims, they trace their line through Ishmael, and they have claimed for centuries, and right up to today, they will still make the same argument, that they are the true heirs to Abraham because they have the patriarchal bloodline. They have the bloodline of the firstborn son, which if Abraham truly was a patriarch, that would have been his heir. Ishmael, the firstborn son, would have been his heir and would have been his prerogative. But in Genesis 16:5 and 16:6, we see that it was Sarah's prerogative to send the slave woman, send her away, because she was Sarah's slave. She didn't belong to Abraham. She belonged to Sarah. And so that slave child was Sarah's responsibility, and Sarah was her prerogative to send them out into the desert to die or whatever, to find their fate. So that is very important, and it's very clear. Her name is the chieftain, and she has this prerogative around the childbirth. And to this day, we trace the bloodline through that matriarchal second child. This is really important. There's really big implications to it, and we see other examples of it. The grandson, so then Isaac, and then Jacob is the grandson. He is the father of 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, Judah and Benjamin and all the rest, Joseph. Now, those 12 sons are born to 4 different women, 2 sisters that are his wives, and then their 2 slave girls. Now, I'm not going to read all the verses, but if you go through it carefully, you'll see that actually they're clearly living in a matriarchal clan, that the women are totally calling the shots on this. They're telling Jacob who to sleep with, who not to sleep with. Sleep with my slave tonight, sleep with me the other night. The women are negotiating between themselves as to who gets to have Jacob. And it's clearly vestiges of this culture. Samson and Delilah is another one. Mm-hmm. He has a previous wife. It's not Delilah, but before Delilah enters the story, there was a previous wife who was a Philistine. Samson went to go live with her, and she stayed in her home. And then it was Samson went and lived with her, and then he went back. Also with Gideon, in the time of the Judges, Gideon has a Canaanite wife who he goes and lives with her, and she has got prerogatives over the children. And so you see it, but only in these older characters, only in these older parts of the story, in the Bronze Age times and during the time of the Judges, where you see these vestiges of these, where the men were going to live with the women. There's other stories too, where the women are coming to live with the men. In the story of Judah and Tamar, Tamar was sent to go live with Judah's family, but she didn't have children because the sons died. And then so she pretends to be a prostitute and gets impregnated by Judah, but Judah doesn't send her out. he said, she was all right with what she did. And that's a story about the Kadesha. She pretends to be a Kadesha, where this is an indication because the Kadesha are the priestesses of these traditions. So the mother goddess and then the Kadesha are the temple priestesses and prostitutes. The word Kadesha means holy ones. These were the holy ones. And so this was part of these traditions and part of what the Israelites are trying, or part of what the followers of Yahweh are trying to get rid of, is get rid of these traditions of this ritual prostitution, which again, it makes sense in these matriarchal clans where the women would be in charge of it. They're in charge of prostitution. And then the children that are born to these women during these ritual sex, they're said to be born of the gods, and they don't have a father. And these are virgin-born children. The priestesses are called virgins, and the goddesses are called virgins. This is a title of respect. And virgin-born children is a trope that repeats over and over and over in the mythology all across the Near East. Children born of the gods. Well, it makes sense when you realize that they were running these sex temples, and that when the women got pregnant, that was how they described it. They described it as being impregnated by the gods. Back to the story of Jacob, it almost seems that that's happening there, because at one point, there's the two wives. Jacob likes one of them. He likes Rachel, and he doesn't like Leah. But it says that Yahweh noticed that Rachel was not being loved, so he conceived with her.
Really?
So it's like, that's interesting.
So it says, I'm not familiar with that.
So let me read it. Genesis 29, 32 to 35. Okay. Leah's the unloved wife. She says, Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, it is because Yahweh has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because Yahweh heard that I'm not loved, he gave me this one too. And it goes on. So I don't know. I don't want to make a big argument about that one. I think you can read it a couple different ways, but it does sort of seem to allude to, are you sure that it was Jacob that knocked her up and not Yahweh knocking her up? But it's a literary trope. Again, that doesn't need to be a strong case of it. We see it with Romulus and Remus of Rome, and there's so many examples of children being born of the gods. Where I also want to get into this is in the Greeks. Are you familiar with the story of the Trojan War and the Iliad and the characters there?
Vaguely.
All right. But you know that it's launched because of Helen of Troy was the most beautiful woman in the world. She was the queen of Sparta, and her husband is the king Menelaus. And when she runs off with Paris, the prince of Troy, they launch the armada because we're told because she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and because Menelaus is so insulted that he's got to win back his pride and his honor and all this stuff. But actually, if you look at the story more closely and go into the Greek mythology and the backstory, you see that she was the heir to the throne. She was also born of the gods. She is the daughter of her mother. Her father is a king, but he was not her father, biological father. She was said to be the child of Zeus and her mother. So she's yet again one of these virgin-born children of the gods, and she was the key to the throne. Menelaus was not part of that family. He became king when he won the contest to marry Helen. Likewise, the other heroes, Agamemnon and Odysseus, same thing is true of their wives. So Helen of Troy, her sister is Clytemnestra, who is the wife of Agamemnon. Agamemnon and Menelaus are brothers. Helen and Clytemnestra are sisters. They are both the heirs to their thrones. Agamemnon became king of Mycenae by marrying Clytemnestra. Odysseus became the king of Ithaca by marrying Penelope. All these kingships, all these thrones were coming down through the women. And this is the Mycenaean culture that collapses in the Bronze Age collapse and is replaced by the Hellenes, the Hellenistic Greeks, which are a different people group. They are super patriarchal. But the stories are about the older people, the older Mycenaeans. And the Mycenaeans still have these matriarchal bloodlines going. And so you see it with all three of these queens, that they were the key to the throne. And each one of them has their own story. The Trojan War is kind of like Star Wars. It's this big epic that spins off all of these backstories and prequel stories. And it's this whole backdrop for loads of different literature. all throughout, classical Greek history. And so each one of these women has their own story. You got the whole story of Helen of Troy, already mentioned, starts our whole armada. The story of Penelope and Odysseus is that Odysseus is gone for 20 years. The Trojan War is 10 years, but then there's Odysseus has a second 10 years, which is the Odyssey. So he's gone for 20 years. The whole time, Penelope is fighting off all these suitors. All these men want to come and marry Penelope. Why do they want to marry Penelope? Because they'll become king, because they'll get the throne. Odysseus became king by marrying Penelope, and if they all assume that he's dead, then some new man can marry her, and he'll become king. And so she has to, there's this whole mythology about how she spins, does her weaving every day, then unweaves it at night, and says, oh, when I'm done with my weaving, I'll pick a new husband. But she never does, because she always takes it apart every night. And it's this whole story of how she's the good, faithful wife, which is true. She's a good, faithful wife. She is waiting for Odysseus, but they're just sort of leaving out this part about like the men want to marry her because they'll become king. The third story, and the most important one, is about Clytemnestra and Agamemnon. Now, Agamemnon was the big king of all of the Greeks. He leads the entire armada. And the prequel there was that he had, before they left for the Trojan War, he had angered the gods, and he was instructed to sacrifice their daughter, Iphigenia, how you pronounce it. They've got all these amazing names. So he tricks his daughter. So his daughter and the mother, Clytemnestra, tells him, I want you to come marry Achilles. Come meet us, at the, where they're all set up for camp. And I'm going to have you marry Achilles, but it's a trick. And so the mother and daughter show up expecting a big wedding feast and find out that it's actually it's going to be a sacrifice, and they're quite horrified. And the mother is totally horrified. Achilles is horrified. He comes to find out that his name has been brought into this, that he didn't know anything about it. So he offers to kill Agamemnon and marry the girl, because she's a lovely girl anyway. But she says no. The girl says no. If the gods order it, then I will willingly go. And so she does. And so Agamemnon, he's sort of like not happy to do it, but he goes and slices his own lovely daughter's throat, and that pleases the gods. The winds pick back up, and they could go set sail for Troy, and they're gone for 10 years. Now, meanwhile, the mother, Clytemnestra, is just beside herself. She is just outraged and insulted and betrayed and horrified, and just on 100 different levels. And so she vows revenge. And so this is a story called the Oresteia, and it's a trilogy that was very famous in ancient Greece. It won the grand prize at for the Aeschylus was the writer. And it's a grand story of them killing off these matriarchal traditions. So what happens is they come back from the Trojan War. While they've been gone, Clytemnestra is the queen. She takes on a lover openly, who is sort of the acting king while Agamemnon is gone. He would like to become the real king. And when they get back, when Agamemnon gets back, Clytemnestra has a big trick in mind. So she acts all happy to see him. Oh, I love you, my victor, my glorious husband. Come in, we're going to have a feast for you and all this stuff. She goes on and on and on. She draws him a bath. And then when he gets in the bathtub, she kills him. And she slices his throat, and then gives a speech publicly declaring what she's done, saying, it was my right to do this. I am effectively saying I'm the matriarch. She killed my daughter. She was the heir to the throne. This is my right to avenge my family and to avenge my clan. It was not only my right, it was my obligation to do this. And she said she's going to marry this new guy, and that this was her right to do so. And so enter Orestes. Orestes, the story is called the Oresteia because it's about their son Orestes. That was part one of the trilogy. Finishes with Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon and declaring her right to do so. Part two is that Orestes is ordered by Apollo, by the gods, to kill his mother in avenge for his father. And so he's not very happy about this. Long story short, he does it. He goes and kills his mother, but he's horrified. He goes and begs God forgiveness. So that's part two. And then part three is he flees to Athens, where they hold the first murder trial. And this is seen as a mythology of the introduction of trial by jury, a jury of 12 peers, where Apollo is going to be the defense attorney. Orestes is going to be put on trial for the murder of his mother. And the Furies, who are the gods of the old goddesses of like clan justice, they were haunting Orestes. So they are going to be the prosecution. Mm-hmm. And Apollo is the defense attorney. Orestes is being put on trial. Athena is the judge. And so the jury is deadlocked. After the whole thing goes, the jury is deadlocked. And Athena comes out to give the final ruling. And she says she acquits Orestes. She says, I award for Orestes because I will always go for the father. I will always go for the father against the mother because we must protect the sacred seed. The father's seed is sacred and the mother's womb is anonymous. And so we must protect the father's seed and not the mother. And so Orestes is acquitted. He becomes the king. And this is seen as a celebration of the end of matriarchy, the introduction of patriarchy, the introduction of Greek trial by jury systems, the end of these tribal clan justice, Hatfield and McCoy sort of, clan warfare sort of thing that they had going. And, Clytemnestra really represents these matriarchal traditions and these mother-daughter royalty traditions that have been going on for centuries and probably thousands of years, but finally get put down once and for all after the Bronze Age collapse. And the Greeks and the Hebrews are totally contemporary cultures, totally parallel. The writing is invented at the same time. These stories are being invented at the same time, being written down at the same time. And so these are parallel things that are happening. The Greeks and the Hebrews are both putting down the women, putting down these matriarchies, and putting an end to these traditions. Mm-hmm. So
gotcha.
If you got any questions, or else I've got more examples, we can keep going forward.
Yeah, we can keep going.
So, so that's where you see them. That's where you can see these matriarchal. And now once I started, so that's what these papers I found was showing where you can see these maternal marriages in these older parts. Now, like, it makes so much sense. And, and that's where these Kadesha fit in. So the Kadesha you also see throughout the First Temple period. And they are part of the Reformation is to get rid of them. So you see them, I mentioned the story of Judah and Tamar, which is during the patriarchs before they go to Egypt. And then when you go back to in the Judges time period, they're totally there. There's all these mentions of Astarte and Asherah in this time period. When King Saul gets killed, King Saul comes before King David. When he gets killed by the Philistines, his battle armor is taken to hang as a war prize in a Philistine temple of Astarte, who's the goddess of love and war. So that was a war prize for them. You get to King Solomon, and King Solomon, who builds the first temple, as we know, at least by tradition. Now the archaeologists will dispute whether there was a first temple. There does not appear to be any evidence of a very wealthy King Solomon or of a overtly powerful United Kingdom. I'm actually still open to the idea that there was a United Kingdom. I just don't think it was rich and powerful. And I certainly open to the idea that there was a house. I certainly think there was a house of David. And I think a King Solomon could have been a real guy. And I do think they had a temple there. I just don't think it was this big and rich and covered in gold and all that. And considering that they have found megalithic stones at the Temple Mount, I'm inclined to believe there was already a temple there prior to the Israelites even showing up. That there was probably a Canaanite temple that was really old, probably 1,000 years older. I'm guessing, but something really old already there.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. You'd wonder what. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of inclined to believe that the Canaanites and Israelites were the same people, right?
Yeah, the Israelites are a subset. I mean, they're one tribe out of the broader Canaanite world.
Okay, so there are people kind of around at the time, and
we're talking about the whole Levant, from Turkey, all of the Phoenicians are Canaanites. So like, I mean, the Canaanites, they have colonies all over the Mediterranean. So, I mean, there's different groups. I mean, the folks in Carthage, you wouldn't say the Israelites are the Carthaginians, but they're all, broadly speaking, Canaanites. So
Sure.
That's my point. I just think the Israelites are a subset. Just say New Yorkers are Americans, but not all Americans are New Yorkers, right? You know,
Gotcha.
That's the way I'm looking at
Gotcha.
it.
All right. And then the views on God, whether you're matriarchal or patriarchal, they seem similar, don't they? That, I mean, you look at the customs that there's polygamy still under the matriarchy, right? Which I guess it would make.
Polyandry. It could be a woman who could have multiple husbands.
Is there are there examples of that?
There is among the gods. Ishtar certainly does.
Okay.
And we have is examples of what they call women of promiscuity. So if we want to jump forward a little bit, one of my favorite parts is Hosea and Gomer. The book of Hosea is from the 800s BC. It's one of the oldest. This is actually one of my favorite parts of this whole discussion. It was one of my favorite. It was one of the first things I discovered when I was doing my research and I writing my book, and it was one of my favorite chapters I wrote, because this is really gets explicit on it. So Hosea is one of the oldest written parts of the Bible, where so like the Song of Deborah is oldest passage, but that's from the oral tradition. Song of Deborah goes back to this around 1150 time period when they're first entering Canaan and fighting these battles with the Egyptians, you know, where they're defeating these Egyptian vassal kings of the Egyptians. And Deborah is an example of one of these matriarchs. I'll come to Hosea in a second. Let me talk about Deborah for a second. So this is one of the oldest passages in the Bible, and Deborah is another one of these matriarchs. She is the leader. She's the mother of the tribe, and she calls the men to battle. She is the one who says it's time to go to war today. So the scholars date this back to this time period, the 1100s BC. The story she's telling is totally a story of this time of lawlessness and social breakdown. She describes that when the people stuck to the back roads and there were bandits all over the place. And this is a time period when they're building hilltop settlements. Why were they building hilltop settlements? The hilltop settlements were not easy places to live because that's not where the farmland is. They're building hilltop settlements because they could defend them. This is a time when it was banditry and chaos all over the place. So they build up on the very top of the hill so they could, you know, they were defensible positions. And this goes on for 200 years, basically. And so Deborah is during this time period. She calls the men to battle. She describes it being a time of lawlessness. And she says, when the people chose new gods. So this is the time period when both the Hellenistic Greeks are formulating Zeus and the Hellenistic pantheon. The Olympian pantheon did not exist in the Bronze Age. It's an Iron Age pantheon. It's also when Yahweh is entering the scene. This is when Yahweh is leading them to battle, when whoever the followers of Yahweh are, they're the ones winning the fights. I mean, the Israelites, they rally around Yahweh because obviously they were the survivors. If they were getting killed off, they wouldn't have been rallying off Yahweh. Obviously, they were the winners. Goes without saying. So while you can debate the historicity of the conquest and the battles of Joshua, I don't think it's in dispute that there was fighting going on. And to some extent, the Israelites were coming out ahead just on virtue that they survived. I mean, they did survive, and we can take that for granted. So I think there's something to be said for these stories about Joshua. I don't think they're all literally true. I think that they build these legends on top of historical events. They dress them up, they pretty them up, but that there is a historical backdrop for the events. And the backdrop is all this fighting that was going on as Egypt power crumbles, and they, over a period of decades, are forced to withdraw from Canaan. That's what they're talking about. That's the time period when the Israelites come in and do all this fighting, go town to town. And because the archaeologists have uncovered evidence of of fighting. I mean, that they know, like in these various towns, it's like there was a fight, just like it was described. So the Bible's not literally true, but it's amazing how much truth there is in it and how much they're telling stories based on actual events, dressing them up, propagandizing them, but there was a real history behind the stories that they're telling. It's really quite fascinating, really.
Yeah. No, yeah. And, you know, when you look into it about how, like, so long ago, you would think, you know, there wasn't the whole record keeping like we have today, right? So it's kind of like vague recollections, right? You know, you might you may have put pen to paper, but with the exile, most people would agree there's something happening there, right?
Yeah, well, we can see Egyptian power breaking up. We see it, and we see the Israelites show up in Egypt or in Canaan. It's 200 years off from what tradition says, but fine. You know, like tradition is based on like these genealogies from the Bible, which are like totally symbolic. You know, when they say 480 years and 40 years of this, those are all like symbolic numbers. But you can take 40 years and say, all right, they're wandering for a generation.
Yeah.
And can we see a generation of wandering, 30-ish years? That you can see.
Well, yeah. Everybody always mentions like 40 years is a long time to go. Like it should have taken like a few weeks, right?
But not if you're nomadic shepherding people and that's what you do. That's how you live normally. If you're already a nomadic people, like that's not really a stretch. And if it was a politically unstable time where they get like they leave Egypt and can't really go back because they fled or got thrown out or whatever, and they can't go into Canaan yet because Egypt still got enough power. So they're kind of stuck to wander around in the hinterlands and the Sinai Desert, which is not a very nice place to be. That kind of makes sense. To me, it's like it's not literally like exactly they followed this precise pathway, went this town to that town on this date and that date. It's not like that. You can't read it so literally. That's a silly way to read the Bible. I mean, I was taught in church not to read the Bible that way. I was taught to read it like, that's the one way not to read the Bible. Like it's clearly symbolic, guys. Like, come on, like, let's work with me here. Like these numbers are not meant to be like, you know, like literally 480 years. It's like, you know, you can take them figuratively.
I was brought up to read it exactly literally, right? The Evangelical Free Church.
In my church, we would have said you guys like didn't know what you're doing.
Yeah. What Methodist?
No, Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So my church is full of like educated government types. It was very much like 19th century rationalism. Nobody was hung up on reading the Bible literally. I was never taught to like suspend my education or skepticism at the door. But those are also the mainline churches that are totally dying out. Those are exactly the churches that are totally have gone away. And the evangelical churches that read the Bible literally, they're the ones that are going strong these days. And all those mainline Protestant churches that were totally wishy-washy, they totally died out.
Yeah, that's I know. You wonder why, because you think if there's more wiggle room to it, you'd be able to.
Christianity is a pretty dogmatic religion, and you give it too much wiggle room, and all of a sudden it's not really Christianity anymore.
Yeah,
it's like with the gay marriage and trans stuff. Like, you know, I can see how Jesus you can get a pro-gay marriage argument from what Jesus said, but you cannot from like the on the ground practical traditions of Christianity. The on the ground practical traditions of Christianity are totally opposed to homosexuality, period. You can't Christianity is a sexually chaste religion. I mean, I have a whole theory that's like a big backbone reason why Christianity became popular. Was its chastity, and that's a whole separate discussion. Actually, I mean, I'll give it to you real brief. I mean, I think that in the olden days, when you have these maternal bloodlines, they're very sexual and very promiscuous because the women could be. And if you have maternal bloodlines, then it's actually not even in a woman's benefit to be monogamous. Your sperm donor can be one guy, and your husband can be a different guy, and there's no real benefit to women to being strictly monogamous. But if you've got patriarchal bloodlines, as you go into the Greek and Roman era, respectable women are expected to be monogamous now and expected to protect these paternal bloodlines. But the men are not monogamous. Greek and Roman men were not monogamous in the least, nor were the Hebrews. Adam is not. Eve is instructed to be monogamous to Adam. Adam is given no such instruction. He is not.
Well, what other choices does he have? Like,
well, if there's no other women around, but
yeah.
But the point is, as a practical matter, in the Roman pagan world, the men were not monogamous. They were not expected to be monogamous, but the women were expected to be monogamous. So this is not a very fair proposition for the women. Christianity comes along with a message of sexual chastity for everybody. The men are supposed to start being chaste as well. And I believe Jesus is chaste. I believe Jesus and Mary Magdalene were not having sex. I don't think they're lovers. It's my view. I don't think they're married. I think if they were married, they would have said they were married. I think they have a chaste relationship. And I think that's part of the appeal. I think that's why there's so many women flocking around Jesus, because they're not being expected to play into like these patriarchal sex games that the Romans have. Now a respectable married Roman woman can encourage her husband, now you got to be chaste as well. I got to be chaste. Now you have to be chaste. And everybody's expected to be chaste because Christianity was very popular with women. Christianity grew with women. In the early days, it was women that were leading the way. It was women that were close to Jesus. It was women that were around Paul. It was women that were forming the first churches. You got to ask yourself, why is it popular with women? Well, because A, they're given some respect, and B, the men are told to behave themselves, which Roman era men were not expected to behave themselves at all. And so, and that's been part of Christian sexual morality ever since. Now, men don't always follow the rules at all, but they're expected to, they're told to. And in the Christian world, men are supposed to be monogamous. Like I said, they don't all do it. And in a patriarchal world, the men can get away with it, whereas the women cannot really, because if a girl wants to go running around getting knocked up by different men, it puts her in a very bad position because it means her baby daddies are not going to like her and not going to support her, and she's going to be out on her own with babies by two different baby daddies, none of whom like her very much and none of whom are supporting her. And so this is a losing proposition for women, generally speaking. And so women are like the slut shamers. It's women that enforce sexual morality on other women. Men don't really enforce sexual morality on women. Men are, generally speaking, perfectly happy for women to be slutty. It's the women that tell other women not that do most of the shaming of other women. But that arises in the context of these paternal bloodlines, and it makes sense in a world of paternal bloodlines. But in a world of maternal bloodlines, totally different story. Now ritual prostitution is great. The prostitute is the highest goddess in the land. And you can have virgin-born children because if a woman is not getting proper loving from her husband, she goes and talks to, the elder woman in town. She says, all right, come on down to the temple and the gods will take care of you. And they can take care of things like that. They can have abortions too. They take care of all of that life cycle matters. And so, so this is what I think what they're fighting about, all the way through the Old Testament, or all the way through the first temple period, I should say. Jump forward to King Solomon. King Solomon is totally worshiping Astarte. He's heavily criticized for it in the Bible. The biblical writers try and excuse it by saying he's just being, influenced by his foreign wives and all this stuff. But really, if you read the text closely, it's clear that he's worshiping in the high place. The high places are these temples. They're just like a patio kind of thing. It's not an enclosed temple, open air places that they would worship the gods on, the pagan gods. King Solomon's worshiping in the high places from the early on. He's building temples to the gods from day one when he built everything else in Jerusalem. So he's clearly polytheistic from the get-go. And he is the father of the wisdom traditions. He is the one who transforms the mother into wisdom. In Proverbs, he describes wisdom as she, and she is like the mother goddess, and she is there alongside Yahweh at creation. And this becomes Sophia. In the Greek, they call her Sophia. And so this becomes a whole tradition of Sophia as wisdom, as the bride of Christ in the Gnostic traditions. This is all started with King Solomon. I like to say that he's the one who transforms, these visceral sexual fertility goddesses into the ephemeral, transcendent wisdom goddess.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but King Solomon is the one who bridges that gap because he was playing both games. Yeah. And the Song of Songs is another example of this. The Song of Songs is a vestige of these old goddess liturgies. The Hieros Gamos was a sacred marriage, one of the most important ceremonies of the pagan world, where the king, it was presumably a sex ritual, but it went on for thousands of years in different communities. So you could have different versions of it. But it's presumably where the king is having sex with the high priestess or some priestess to confirm his virility and to confirm the fertility of the land and to confirm the blessings of the goddess. And it was an incredibly important tradition. And they would have these love poetries read out. And we have lots of examples of it going all the way back to the oldest Mesopotamian writings. And it follows a form. And the Song of Songs is right out of this form. And it's totally right out of these liturgies. And it's the one and only sexy, romantic text in the whole Bible, Old and New Testament. And it's one of the few places where a woman is really given a voice. It's the only place where the woman is given a romantic voice. And it's right out of these love poetry. And scholars will say it's dated, that it's later. I don't agree. I can see that it being the language being updated in Persian times or more verses added or what have you. I can see that, but the original story, the origins of it have to be really old, because I just cannot imagine post-exilic rabbis writing up the Song of Songs. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense if it's really old.
Yeah, it is out of place, isn't it? Where you wonder how it made its way in.
It only makes sense if it's really old and that it was already traditional and that it was one of those things that they couldn't. There's all these embarrassing details in the Old Testament where you can see the biblical writers, all the stuff by King Solomon especially, but you see with King David and you see it with other spots where, like, they're really in all the various kings, the good kings, the bad kings, where they're really, you can see the biblical writers wrestling with, like, how do we make excuses for this? How do we make excuses for King Solomon worshiping the goddesses? Like, so they got to come up with some excuse. If it was complete fiction, they just would not have had those details at all, right? Like, why, if you're just creating all this stuff out of thin air, why would you put all these odd, embarrassing details in there? So clearly these stories have some older roots about them.
Yeah. And so there's a Hebrew tradition of these, like, love poems and reading them in the temple.
Is that a question, or is that I mean, I think there's a tradition all across the Near East, these, and the finer points of it, we don't know. All we have of the first temple is what's in the Bible. We don't really have anything else, not much, but we do have one that's really good. So the Kadesh, I was mentioning, the Kadesh are the priestesses called the holy ones. The Kadesh are the transgender priests that are there, also called the temple harlots, that are there alongside them. And that's also a tradition of transgenderism, was a part of these mother goddess traditions. That's also totally all across the Near East. You see it from the earliest Mesopotamia all the way into the Roman era, when the Galai priests of the goddess Cybele were castrating themselves and turning themselves into women in service of the mother goddess. And they're called the Kadesh in the Old Testament. They're only ever mentioned when they're being thrown out. But again, why would you mention them to throw them out if you're just inventing them out of thin air? Like, wouldn't even have invented them. So they mentioned them to get rid of them, but that means that they were there. And so I was mentioning Hosea. Hosea and Gomer is a story about Hosea is a prophet of Yahweh, but he's living in Israel. And he is talking about, he is told to go marry a woman of promiscuity. And so his wife is Gomer. And if you read a modern Christian exegy on this story, they will say that, she was just as, prostitution was just as scandalous then as it is now. No, she is one of these Kadesha. At least that's my theory. She's not explicitly called a Kadesha, but I'm saying she is. She's at least out of this tradition, and she's having children by different men that all belong to her. And then when he wants her to come back to him, he's got to go bring her a bunch of, it's all barter, not money. So he's got to bring her a bunch of like olive oil and stuff and barley and stuff to like win her back. And then there's this whole long thing about how he's going to end her traditions and end her festivals. And you can really see that it's the, it's this allegory for Yahweh talking to the mother goddess. It's Yahweh talking to Israel, but it's also Yahweh talking to the mother goddess, saying, I will hem you in, I will bring you back and not let you chase after your lovers. I'm going to end your festivals and end your festivities. It's really quite beautifully written, and it's very old. And then you get into the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah. So as you go through the book of Kings, it goes through like every single king of Judah, and then the nation split after King Solomon's son is Rehoboam, and he's a bad king. And so Jeroboam is from Israel, and they have a revolt and splits the country into two separate countries. And Israel, the northern kingdom, was actually historically the bigger, more powerful, more well-known, more well-attested of the two, because Israel was actually only existed for about 200 years, but in its day was really quite powerful for the era, and is eventually gets destroyed by the Assyrians. And we have loads of records from the Assyrian time period talking about Israel, so we know it was real. And we see the wars that they fought in and their victories from an Assyrian perspective. So, and they were pagan the entire time. They never were true to Yahweh. They were never. Even in the scripture, it says when Jeroboam separates, the very first thing he does is to break away from the worship at the Jerusalem temple, and they build golden calves in Bethel, in the towns of Bethel, and one in the town of Dan. Bethel is in the south, Dan is in the north, and this is the golden calf, which is like with Moses on Mount Sinai. This is a symbol of El, and a symbol of the old pagan ways. Whereas Yahweh are the reformers. Yahweh was a young God, a new God. And El and Yahweh were two totally separate gods who get merged later on. And in this time period, they're still totally separate. And Yahweh are these reformers. They want to end all the sex stuff. They want to end the child sacrifice, which was a reality. They really were doing child sacrifice. And those sacrifices were being made to El. Be very clear about this. Those sacrifices were made to El. El demands it. In Exodus, says, give me your firstborn sons. Because these old traditions, the Canaanites and Phoenicians really did do this. They really did sacrifice their firstborn children. And the Greeks talk about it. The Romans talk about it, about the Phoenicians doing it. They always describe them as sacrifices of Kronos, which was the Greek equivalent of El. And so you get to where in the scripture, you see the reforms. There's two kings of Judah that are truly true to Yahweh. And they're true to these reforms. And these are the reformers. That's Hezekiah and Josiah. Now, Hezekiah is a real person. We know Hezekiah is a real person. He was in the late 700s BC. So Israel gets destroyed by the Assyrians around 720 BC. King Hezekiah was a young king at this time period. And he witnesses that event. And he knows Assyria is coming for them next. And so he spends many years fortifying Jerusalem. And he does something very remarkable, which is that they dig a tunnel from the Gihon spring inside the walls of Jerusalem to channel the water into Jerusalem. And they talk about this in the scripture. They talk about how he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and all this stuff. And that tunnel was subsequently lost because there was an earthquake in the Middle Ages. But modern archaeologists have found that tunnel. And as a tourist, you can go into it. And in the middle of the tunnel, they have an inscription on the wall where the two teams of miners met in the middle. They started from two different ends. It's like 500 meters long. It's like a long tunnel, 700 meters, something like that. It's pretty long. And no modern engineers know how they did it. This is 700 BC. And they dug from two separate ends and they met perfectly in the middle. And they put this inscription on the wall that you can read today as a tourist. And you can walk through the water in the tunnel. It's amazing. And they talk about this in the scripture. And there it is as a real event. And the Assyrians talk about King Hezekiah because they do come and attack Jerusalem. And they lay waste to all of Judah. And they come knocking on the door at Jerusalem, and they lay siege to Jerusalem, and only by divine intervention, by the skin of their teeth, do they survive? Do the Israelites survive? Because basically Hezekiah bribed them. He gave them all the wealth that they had in the city, stripped all the gold from the temple, even gave him his daughters and his wives, his concubines. He gave him everything, and got the Assyrians to leave. The Assyrian, and this is documented in the scripture, in the book of Kings, says exactly that. He gave them all the wealth, all the gold from the temple. The Assyrians describe the same event. The Assyrians also write up this exact same event. They just say that Hezekiah gave them more gold than what the Israelites describe. So it's incredible that we've got the same story from both the side of the Bible and from the Assyrian side, describing the same event on the same day in the same way. And the Assyrians say they left, and so the Israelites survived, because if they had breached the walls that day and they had killed Hezekiah, that would have been the end of the cult of Yahweh. And there would never have been, there would have been no more Yahweh. There would have been no Judaism. There would have been no exile to Babylon. They would never even have gotten to that point. And that would have been the end of the whole story before it even began. Like the whole Yahweh story is like alive by just this barest flicker of a candle, this raging inferno that, Yahwism is today, is the dominant, three religions on the planet, or at least, Islam and Christianity, the two biggest religions on the planet, plus Judaism. At that point, it was down to just, the people living inside the walls of Jerusalem, because all of Judah had been laid to waste and Israel didn't even exist anymore. So Hezekiah is a reformer. They talk about how, aside from this, how he cut down the Asherah poles and emptied the temples to Baal and, turned over the altars and all this stuff. And then, but these were not particularly popular reforms. And as soon as he dies and his son, King Manasseh, comes along, they go back to being pagan again. And King Manasseh was actually pretty successful king. He ruled for like 40 years. We've got records of him from the Assyrian side again. They were pretty prosperous, but they were totally pagan. And the Bible talks about Manasseh being a bad king. And then there's another guy for a short reign, and then Josiah comes along. And Josiah is the second of these important reformers. And Josiah also cuts down the Asherah poles, turns over the altars, destroys one of the temples to Baal, turns it into a latrine, all this stuff. So archaeologists have found one of these temples. This is incredible. That at Tel Arad, Tel Arad is the one and only temple from this time period, from the first temple of time period, that was built to Yahweh outside of Jerusalem that they have found. But it's one of these places where they have Yahweh being worshipped alongside Asherah, because in this time period, when they were still pagan, Yahweh is mainly fighting with Baal to become king of the gods, and the goddesses are still around. So Yahweh is being worshipped alongside the mother goddess, alongside Asherah, just the way Baal was worshipped alongside Asherah. So they have found there's a whole lot of references to Yahweh and his Asherah. There's a half a dozen different locations around Israel from this time period that they have found inscriptions and things that are Yahweh and his Asherah. And they have all those goddess figurines in all the homes and everything. I'm sure you've seen them. The pillar-based figurines that were all over Judah. Very, very common. They have found thousands and thousands of them. And it's always a mother, with a big breasts and everything. They stop being made. At a certain point, they stop being made. And it's either during, the level of precision only gets so close. So they're not sure if these temples are overturned during Hezekiah or Josiah. But the one at Tel Arad the temple is laid out with a main room and then a holy of holies on the inside, just like the temple of Jerusalem is described. And inside the Holy of Holies, there's a standing stone for Yahweh and a standing stone for Asherah right next to it. And then there's two incense altars, a taller one for the taller standing stone for Yahweh. And on that, they found residues, and they've done chemical analysis of the residue, so they know what the incense was. On the one for Yahweh, it's frankincense, And on the shorter altar that's for the Asherah is hashish, is cannabis, it's marijuana. And because I make this big argument that cannabis is all wrapped up in this stuff too. They're burning cannabis in the first temple, and that is deeply sacred in these goddess traditions because it's a fiber. Cannabis isn't just a drug, it's also a fiber. It's also hemp fibers. They do all this weaving. It's a midwifery medicine. It's an aphrodisiac. So it's a sex religion, a fertility religion. And you've got this one plant that provides the fiber, the sex drugs, the midwifery medicine, all of it, all in one. So I argue that it's totally important, totally sacred. And there we've got the analysis that shows that, in fact, we're burning it to Asherah. But then what's even more amazing, this temple was deliberately buried. The altars were knocked over by hand carefully. The standing stones were knocked over, and it was all buried with shovels in dirt, like deliberately, not destroyed in a battle, not burned down in some destruction. These were deliberately buried during these reforms. And so it's the Bible story being confirmed. We don't know if it's Hezekiah or Josiah. It's one or the other. I'll leave to others to debate that. But it's clearly, definitively, these same reforms. And this is also when those pillar-based figurines stopped being made. Now, if it's during the time of Josiah, that's only in the last couple of years before the Babylonians come along and burn the whole place down anyway. So it'd be very close to the final years of the first temple. And so, and then it's over in Jerusalem. But that whole first temple period was completely pagan, completely polytheistic, and the mother goddess was going strong. Another time they talk about it is with Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, after the destruction of Babylon, or by the Babylonians. He's hanging out with the exiles, and he gets into an argument with the women saying it's your fault because you were worshiping the Queen of Heaven. And they say, no, hell no, fuck you. Sorry.
Yep, there goes my channel. I got 3 strikes now, but
they say, piss off, Jeremiah. And I can give you the Bible quote on this too. Everything was fine when we were worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Did our husbands not know what we were doing with our drink offerings? And so clearly, and I argue the Queen of Heaven is Astarte. Some people say it's Asherah, but they're all worshipped together anyway. So it's a nuanced point. They were doing it right up to the end. So that entire first temple is polytheistic, and they're fighting over these matriarchal traditions. And then when they go to Babylon, that's when they write up the Torah. That's when they come back for the second temple. So like 150 years later, we come back to this date of 458. I was mentioning 458 BC when Aeschylus published the Oresteia. That is also one of the suggested dates that Ezra, the lawgiver, is that the rabbis by tradition say that he brought the freshly minted Torah back to Jerusalem from Babylon at the beginning of the second temple period. So Ezra, by tradition, he presumably put together, he was the editor, the lead of the team of scribes that patches together takes all these old texts and writes new texts and pieces together the whole Torah and brings it back to Jerusalem. Now, obviously, there's lots of debate about this, and we could go on and on and on for many hours about which stuff is when and here and who wrote what point in time period. And I have no doubt that they continued to work on it for another couple hundred years. So I'm not saying it's all like literally complete, but I think that the lion's share of what we call the Torah today is this document that Ezra brings back to Jerusalem in 458 BC, the same year that Aeschylus is published in the Oresteia. And so symbolically, what this means is that both the Greeks and the Hebrews are celebrating what had already happened in culture centuries earlier. That these matriarchies had been knocked off centuries earlier as a practical matter, but this is celebrating in mythology and in remembrance of these older events. They've now been turned into mythology. And Eve, I'll finish up with my last point is that the Garden of Eden story is a reflection of this. That Eve in the Garden of Eden represents Asherah and the Kadesha and this whole suite of traditions. Eve is called the mother of all living. Her The goddesses were associated with snakes, sacred plants, both of which get demonized in the Garden of Eden. God says, don't go eating from the tree of knowledge. Well, why not? The tree of knowledge seems pretty groovy to me. They eat it. It's good for food. They learn all this stuff. Well, because this is one of these sacred plants that's giving them knowledge. I argue that it's cannabis. What do? The first thing they do is take threads and make clothes. Well, those were hemp threads. Hemp was there at the very dawn of the Neolithic. Yahweh says, I don't want you. I'm going to punish you to turn you into farmers. I want you guys to be shepherds. So I want you to wear skins of, I don't want you wearing these clothes you're making. I want you wearing animal skins because we like the shepherds, not the farmers. Cain and Abel, their children, are a farmer and shepherd. Cain is the first farmer. The farmers are the goddess worshippers in the cities. The shepherds are the father worshippers out in the country, and they're rivals. And so the story is being written by shepherds. Abel is the good shepherd boy, innocent and virtuous, whose offerings of the firstborn of his flock are, loved by God. Abel brings Cain, who's a farmer, brings his vegetables. They're no good because that's the kind of stuff that be offered to the mother goddess. And so Cain is very upset that his offerings are being rejected. And so he goes and kills Abel, so it's basically that murderous, horrible, untrustworthy farmer guy, that damn liberal, he's, you can't trust those guys. Like they're going to murder, you innocent, virtuous shepherds. That's my take on that story. And then Cain becomes the father of all the farmers. His people form the first cities. The cities are where all this sex is going on. That the people, the shepherds out in the country don't like it. Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why is it destroyed? Because of all their illicit sex habits. Like they're way too gay and they're way too promiscuous. And so God strikes them down with a comet, which, by the way, actually may turn out to be an actual historical event because there's another something that archaeologists have dug up that would appear to have been destroyed by a comet, and something like the the Tunguska event, from Siberia. I've
heard the name, but I'm not super familiar. And so I would presume it's a meteor. I think a comet would destroy the Earth entirely. Yeah.
So it's from it's like from 100 years ago, the 19 teens, and a comet is made of ice, and so it has an airburst. It doesn't necessarily hit the ground. So the Tunguska event is up in Siberia, and it's an airburst. It's a comet or something coming in, and it explodes in the air, but it's like a nuclear bomb going off. It destroys everything for 100 square miles. I mean, I have to look it up to get the exact numbers correct, but it levels all the trees for 100-kilometer circle, and then the shock waves are felt for thousands of miles. But because it's out in the middle of Siberia, nobody was killed. It didn't fall in a city. The presumption now is of this site that they've dug up that it's like from the 1600s BC. It's totally from the right time period, and that it would appear to have been destroyed by an extraterrestrial impact and by an airburst. They've got all these signs that the city was violently destroyed, that it's all burned and charred with like melted glass, like the sand is melted to glass. That only comes from extraterrestrial impact. That's not from human fires. And so that could be a totally historical event. And then people tell stories about it. Why was that city destroyed? I'll tell you why they were destroyed. Because they're a bunch of, perverts. They're a bunch of homosexuals, lascivious, just like modern day conservatives would say that about, they say AIDS was, God striking down the homosexuals. Well, that was God striking down Sodom and Gomorrah for being a bunch of sodomites.
Got it.
So
but
I
think fact, they weren't much more gay than the other cities around it. That's just the story that was made up.
It was a story, but the point is it was made up after an actual event.
Yeah.
It wasn't made up out of whole cloth. That there was there was a reason why they were telling the story, because this story was floating around. This event was remembered by people.
Yeah. Yeah. And the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, that's an interesting one on what's going on, right? Like we have Sophia, who, in Gnosticism is, either the twin syzygy, the bride of Christ,
right, the bride of Christ,
and or she's another emanation, and her and Christ are trying to redeem humanity from the demiurge, right? And I think, it couldn't,
which lines up, by the way, with El and Yahweh as two separate gods. With El as the old creator, he's the monad. Yahweh is the son, who is the creator of the world we live in, which is kind of true, like in a sense, Yahweh is the God of our culture. So you could say like he's the creator God of this culture, but he's the son of the monad, the high, primordial creator of the universe, So I do think that notion of the monad and demiurge parallels this idea of El and Yahweh as two separate gods. Yeah. And then Sophia, she is the third part of the Trinity. She fits in where the Holy Ghost is, which is like this placeholder. Like, what is the Holy Ghost? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, doesn't make any sense at all. But it makes sense when you say it's not monotheism, but that it's, Father, Son, and the bride. Now you're into an Isis, Osiris, Horus type of Egyptian style Trinity, which is closely related to, from an iconography perspective, you see that, the Madonna and Child, the iconography of the Christian Madonna is totally taken from the old iconography of Isis nursing Horus. They're like, you can't even dispute that it's not the same story. The stories are different, but the iconography is the exact same. And that's not even unique there either. There's other examples of a nursing mother goddess type stuff from Mesopotamia. So that is a really old motif, and one that gets repeated over and over again.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that El as the monad, which I guess Yahweh or El, well, he's not that good because he's demanding child sacrifice.
Yeah, every culture tells these stories in different ways. And Yahweh, this is the one thing I will agree with the cult of Yahweh on, ending the child sacrifice, I think we can all agree on, was a step in the right direction. That is a pretty gruesome tradition that they had. It would appear that they did quite a bit of it. And, and it's a stupid and futile gesture, along with orgies in the fields to promote the growth of crops. Although I've had some people joke about it that it does work, but that's
yeah. I think there's a famous mythicist, I think, who proposes that. Just kidding, but Yahweh. That's a plus, right? No more child sacrifice, right? But then we have the genital mutilation. That's the first thing he does is institute that.
The circumcision, I think, is an old tradition. I write about it in my book, although I think I get it wrong in my book. I'm the first to admit that there's things in my book that I would change in a second edition. Minor stuff. I stand by the big picture of my book 100%, but there are details that I would change. And that's one of them. I think this, because I make an argument that circumcision was a symbolic of breaking away from these sex traditions. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's really old. I think they were doing it before. If anything, it might even come out of these mother goddess traditions. It may have been the women doing it first. I honestly don't know, but it appears to have roots in Egypt. They were much older. I don't have a position on. Similar. I withdraw my argument on circumcision in the Bible, but that's in my book.
Yeah,
I would delete that chapter.
And with Sophia, returning to the Garden of Eden as the serpent, right? There's some tradition that have her as the serpent, not the devil. Like, she is demonized.
She's not the devil. Yeah, the way modern Christians say the serpent is the devil, it's just not. That's not even remotely what.
You would think if the serpent was the devil, you'd think it would say that, right? Where he's only or she, right? If you're able to that,
You got to remember, these stories are written for contemporary audiences. They're not written for people 1,000 years in the future. They're written for the people that living in that day. So these symbols are relevant to the people of the day. And the serpents, that doesn't go away as a symbol. in 500 BC, that's a symbol all the way through Greek and Roman cultures. It continues on, and we still use it today as for medicine. The caduceus with the serpent going up a staff. Moses has a serpent staff, and the serpent is a symbol of power for Moses. And he makes the Neshu stand, the bronze serpent on a pole. That again, Hezekiah breaks that apart as one of his reforms because that was a pagan tradition. Well, it just goes to show that I don't know if there was a real Moses or not, or if this is a composite character or what, but those stories are clearly very, very old because at the time of Hezekiah, they're changing the traditions. Those stories were already around at the time of Hezekiah, 700 BC. And they were worshiping Moses in those days. So Moses was clearly a legendary figure in that first temple period already. And he was pro-serpent. He's pro-serpent. So clearly the Garden of Eden story is coming after these reforms or in the context of these reforms, or it's even written in Babylon. I'm not going to put a hard date on it. I do think I'm inclined to believe the story is written later. But it's certainly no earlier than the reforms of Hezekiah, because at that point, the serpent was still a powerful symbol of something positive. And it's only as a function of these reforms that the serpent gets turned into something that's bad. And that is a really important symbolism, because the serpents are totally a part of these mother goddess traditions, all the way back to the Minoans. You've got priestesses and goddesses constantly being depicted with snakes in their hands. They would breed snakes. They had snakes at the temples, because one of the things that the temples did is they were granaries, and they would store grains there, and the farmers would bring all the grains to the temple, and then they would be redistributed through the town. It was kind of a socialist sort of I hate the word socialist because it's atheist, but it was these egalitarian cultures and these sharing cooperative cultures. And it is where, Marx and Engels get their ideas from these old mother goddess ideas. These were cooperative societies. And so they would redistribute the grain, but they would store it in the temples. And serpents are good for that because they eat the rodents. And so they eat the mice. And so they would keep snakes around the grain because it doesn't eat the grain, but does eat the mice. And so they would breed. And also, I think you can get bit by snake venom and have all sorts of like hallucinogenic drug type things. And they're doing a lot of drugs, a lot of sex and drugs and music and dance. And so there's like, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll is just like all over the place. And so, again, it's where the psychedelics come in, the cannabis, pretty much everything. One of my arguments is that just about everything that today's liberals are fighting about from a culture war perspective tracks back to these mother goddess traditions. Liberals just don't see it because they're a bunch of Marxists and atheists. But feminism, environmentalism, sexual freedom for women and gays, cannabis and psychedelics, cooperation, socialism style, transgenderism, abortions, every last one of these things is something that in the temples of Asherah, those priestesses would have been champions of, and that you would have gone to talk to these Kadesha priestesses to get all those services. Literally, it's all wrapped up in all of it. And if today's liberals decide to change into a spiritual argument, they would see that this is mother goddess stuff right down the line. But that's not where today's culture is at. They're not doing any spirituality at all. It's all strict scientific materialism, and atheism is definitely the zeitgeist of the moment right now.
Yeah, very true. All right, so maybe we'll start summing up here.
Yeah, this has been good.
Any final thoughts or anything that we didn't cover?
Oh, those deep dives we could do on any one of these little subjects, but I think it's been pretty good. I think we got through a lot of material today, and I am working on turning it into a more formal presentation. So it's good to practice, and I appreciate talking to you, and I'm happy to go through this stuff more, or, we could prepare more questions or get some other people in here to talk with it. But I got to say, I think people have been overlooking just how important the mother goddess is. The scholars are quick to point out that there was a goddess there, but they don't really seem to want to dive into what she was representing and what it means that they got rid of her. Because I think it's at the heart of the entire Reformation. It's not just polytheism to monotheism. It's matriarchy to patriarchy, and it's elimination of nature worship. And it's this transformation from maternal bloodlines to paternal bloodlines. And that's really transforms the entire structure of how your entire society and families are organized and set up. So it's pretty important stuff, man. It has really sweeping implications.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you don't hear a lot about it either. But it's just kind of.
I feel like I present this stuff and people are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I never heard of it.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. Well, all right. So thank you so much for coming. Very
Is there any questions that came in at all, or was anyone?
No, it's just hello. Like, so we have Sobek. He's on all the streams. Sobek Lord of the Ford Corner says good afternoon, but no questions. Maybe it's kind of related to the whole thing with what is even going on. We're not even familiar. Oh, here we go. Here's Lauren. She's a big fan here. Very interesting. Thank you. Or really interesting in this Reddit.
Well, you're welcome, Lauren. Thank you for the comment.
Yeah. So yeah, for sure. Oh, what's this? We don't want to derail the conversation too often.
I feel like I'm very quick to like fall into tangents all the time, and there's always different directions to go. And I'm trying to get better at that, my presentation on that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so thanks to everybody who watched till the end. Feel free to like and subscribe. I've just added, see, I can point over here. I got it down. Like there's the subscribe button, you'll notice in the lower. I just added that today. So it makes for easier subscribing now. If you want to argue in the comment section, that's great too. Dislike, you can even dislike it. Sky's the limit here. But thanks so much. Edward, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Elliot.
Remember to buy his book too, and
get it on Amazon or from the publisher from Trying Day.
Yep, good deal. I'll put a link in the description here. I know they kicked me off of Amazon affiliates for not selling enough stuff, so once I do that, I get on. You better buy it, or else I'll get kicked off again for not. What do you call it? Referring enough people. But yeah, thanks everybody and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Elliot.